Okay, I'm going to move on, and we have another panelist with us this afternoon. This is Mary Lee.
Okay, thanks, Mary Lou. The first experience, this was when I was working as a CPA. We got a call on a Sunday night, actually, from a physician who had a bookkeeper that he trusted very much with his business, and which was audited regularly, reviewed on a monthly basis. But he also gave her access to his personal information. She would run errands for him, write personal checks for his utilities, everything else, and she had his credit card. He signed the checks to pay this credit card every month, but was not very careful to look at the detail behind them. Just trusted her that it was all correct. Well, this Sunday, he happened to look at the detail and noticed that there were cash advances charged to his credit card. And he knew that he was not responsible for those. So they called us in the next morning, had us go through the records, found out that she had taken nearly $39,000 in cash advances over a period of time from him. She had never intended to let the debt grow to that amount. She had intended to pay it back. Her husband had a drug abuse problem and had asked her to help him get a fix here and there, so she would borrow the money. As it snowballed, it became impossible for her to pay it all back. The physician did not choose to press charges because her father stepped in and repaid all of the money. Came to find out, someone finally picked up the phone and called her prior employer that she had done the same thing there. The father had bailed her out also, and they had not pressed charges. So you could run a criminal background check on her, and she appeared fine. They had not done a good job checking references on her before they hired her.
Oh, it's just so amazing. Sorry to stop you right there, but that just happens so many times in churches. You know, they don't do any kind of checking and pay the price, unfortunately.
Well, I think in the church environment, it's that you were talking about the affinity fraud. That's the perfect example. Everybody comes in talking about being a Christian and their faith journey, and it's hard to believe they're capable of something like that. So you're right. You're at great risk.
True.
The second experience was in the church where I presently serve as financial secretary and was a member many years before that. We hired an outside janitorial service, and we had a man that would come in and open things up in the morning, and he stayed till around noon. And he had been working for us for several years, and all of a sudden things began to come up missing. We had a laptop in our coffee shop that turned up missing. Somebody called several weeks later and had bought it from the Salvation Army thrift shop, but it kept coming to our webpage, so they called and said, "Hey, are you missing the laptop?" We were able to get it back, but the small change in the coffee shop would disappear. And finally, the contributions one Sunday when the girl came in on Monday, this was before I began to work here, came in on Monday morning, and the Sunday contributions that were locked up in a fireproof file cabinet were gone. Someone did find where the checks had been dumped in the dumpster, but the cash, of course, was gone. Mm-hmm. We got on past that, recovered the checks as best we could, and just wrote the cash off as a loss. Well, it happened again, and that time somebody said, you know, this is sounding more and more like an inside job, and we set up a surveillance system, had 4 cameras installed at doors and on this particular closet that the money's locked in.
Very smart, very smart.
Turned out to be the fellow from the janitorial service, which was a bonded service, but it was still, you know, he saw the opportunity of the keys there. The last story is, this is a treasurer, volunteer treasurer for a school PTO group. She served for 2 years, and along the way there had been grumblings about, shouldn't we have more money than this? But nobody had really looked into it, and they had asked me to serve the next year as treasurer. So she gave me a copy of the financial statements as of the date she was handing it over to me, and that was it. And I said, do you not have your financial records and bank statements from the prior years? And she hemmed and hawed and put me off and got to where she wouldn't take my phone calls or anything else. And then finally one day I left a message saying, please bring me something or I'll need to contact some other folks. Well, she eventually brought me her records, spreadsheets, that sort of thing, but she would not bring me bank statements. And I had to call the bank to get bank statements, and it became apparent very quickly what she had been doing and why there was no money in the PTA account. She was taking cash from the fundraisers she would write checks to cash, sometimes as much as $2,500 a pop, and record them as written to someone else, or she would take a legitimate check, maybe reimbursing a teacher for supplies for $150, she would record it as $350. And no one was following. She was also reconciling the bank statement. She was the only person collecting the cash and the money at the fundraisers and making the deposits. Nobody was reviewing the financial statements, and nobody was comparing it to prior year or to the budget. So there were, I mean, she just had total control. And at one point in a meeting, somebody suggested doing an audit, and her response was, "Now, why would you want to do that?"
Oh,
Which
yeah,
hindsight,
no
they should have jumped right on it. But we compared all the checks and eventually found she had taken nearly $29,000.
Wow.
My recommendation, if you ever come upon something like this, is we debated, where we didn't have very much money, we're a not-for-profit, it's a school organization, whether to hire an attorney or not. At first we decided, no, the district attorney is our friend, he will take care of this. Somebody's spouse stepped up and said, "I'm an attorney, and if you'll pay me a very small retainer, I'll help walk you through this."
Oh, excellent.
We were very glad that we did that, because the DA's office was very happy to settle for no jail time and for her to pay this $29,000 back over 5 years at $500 a month or thereabouts. And her husband was unemployed, and she was like an assistant school teacher or something.
Mm-hmm.
And we were not, the PTA was pretty angry about it, because she had been living above her means. We had seen her take a trip to Disney World and buy a new car, knowing that her husband's unemployed and she does not have a very high-paying job. But we said, no, we'd like for there to be jail time. This is not a satisfactory event. And, of course, the minute we started to push the jail time, she came up with the $29,000, which we were able to have access to for the next school year.
Oh, amazing how she could just come up with that money, isn't it? Very interesting. Oh, those are excellent stories, and they point to so many lessons that we can learn from our different situations that happen to us. And I think that's why a lot of people have joined us today in our webinar, is how can we prevent this from happening in our church? So just stay on the line there for a minute. We're going to go through these lessons learned. Obviously, the first one, background checks and references. And that is just another reason to prosecute. I mean, sometimes if somebody doesn't have a criminal record because churches do not pursue any kind of paying for the penalty, they just forgive and forget, then you have a bad situation. So for future employees or future volunteers at churches. So lots of times they are trusted employees or volunteers. The situation with the safe, I remember thinking that lots of times churches get into a routine where, you know, the counters do it every Sunday afternoon, and somebody could be watching from the outside and see that pattern and very quickly pick up on the church's routine. So that is something that you could probably change up once in a while. I know that's hard for some churches. We've always done it this way. We hear that all the time. Yeah, just consider changing your routine and throwing the thieves off so that they can't get their hands on your money.
Mary Lou?
Yeah, go ahead.
What we did also in that case is have the money counters actually make a night deposit on Sunday, so that that money is not even kept at the church anymore.
Right. That's a great idea. That's the way we used to do it at our church. It was called unworked. You could actually take it to the bank. The bank wouldn't process it, and then in the morning someone would drive by. Of course, it would be locked in one of those bags, and then we could take it to the church and count it and enter it right into the system. So that provided some internal controls, I should say. Excellent. Those were great stories. Does anybody else have any questions? I see it's really funny. We have a couple of Mary Lees as customers, and Mary Lee, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Dugan, is saying, "What? Another Mary Lee?" when I introduced you. So it's kind of funny. It's kind of a name like Mary Lou, so there's not too many of us around. In answer to the question from James's, the name of the church was actually World Pentecost, and one of our other attendees looked that up on the internet while we were talking, and she said it came up right away about the pastor under indictment. So interesting stuff, and we appreciate very much your stories. Thank you for participating. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Mary Lee?
I think you've covered it well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, great. It was a pleasure. Okay, next up is one of my coworkers. Her name is Carolyn, and she's one of the technicians with us here at Church Windows. Perhaps you've called in and asked some accounting questions, and Carolyn is one of our experts in that area. And she has some stories from customers. Actually, not a good thing in some ways, but she did find out some information for us to help us out today. So can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. You're loud and clear.
Okay. I've been with the company for about 10 years, and we do occasionally hear stories about, people taking advantage of the church, and it always saddens us when we hear that, because it's so hard on the churches to try to make up the loss. This particular church, this has happened in one church, and it really stood out. It was really awful. The person had total responsibility for every aspect of church management. She did the contributions, the financial, the payroll. She did the banking, the deposit, the check signing, the reconciliation, literally everything they trusted her with. And this was over the course of 7 years. And the theft involved all of the modules. She used to keep all the loose offering for contributions. Church Windows has a feature where you can transfer the contributions directly into financial. And this way you have an audit trail. You can double check what you've done in contributions to what you've posted into financial. She decided not to use that. She went in and manually then entered the contributions through posting income into financial and used different dates so that when they ultimately tried to go back and check it out, they had a really hard time matching things up. In the financial area, she wrote initially a lot of manual checks. She wrote them to legitimate vendors, legitimate payees, but the checks were written out to herself. When she had to go to computer checks, she would write the checks, do the transactions to herself, then she would reverse them and repost them in as legitimate vendor postings. When she had to transfer money from checking to savings or back and forth, she wrote the money to her check, to herself. To find out what happened, the church ultimately had to get check copies from the bank to try to backtrack. She did the bank reconciliations all manually, not in the system. When they went to look, nothing was marked as cleared. They had no reference point where to start. They couldn't tell what had happened if everything had been logged in correctly. It was really hard to backtrack what she did because she did not use the bank reconciliation in the system to verify, and no one was double checking her. The most interesting one I thought was in payroll. She went ahead and did all the payrolls correctly. She filed all the 941s, did all the W-2s, sent out the W-3s. Then at the end of the year, she went back into the prior year and issued additional checks for herself, as several other employees and herself, as manual checks.
Oh,
and didn't
that is
transfer
so
them over.
appalling. I've just got to stop you right there. That is totally unbelievable. So actually moved the year back and wrote checks to herself.
Right, and
okay.
It was real interesting because the only way they could discover it was accidentally. An employee had lost his W-2, and they had to go back into the prior year to find, to reprint him another one. And that's when he looked at his line 1 and said, this isn't right, this isn't what I made. And that's when they started double checking payroll. When she realized they were kind of, getting on to her, she left on the spur of the moment. She took all the program CDs, all the paper records, the backup of the data. She uninstalled the program. What she didn't know was that the pastor had done a backup of the complete system on his own and had it. So we sent them replacement CDs, and they figured out over the course of the 7 years they had lost about $150,000, and they did prosecute her.
Very good. Oh my, that is quite the story, and it was all one person.
All one person, all one church.
Yep.
Yeah, just no double checks.
Right. Goes to the whole checks and balances issue. There should not be one person that's doing it from start to finish. We've heard this over and over again. But yay for the backup for the pastor.
Yes.
Pastor comes out good on this one. It's nice to hear a story. We're trying not to slam pastors or church administrators like I used to be. But yeah, it's really terrible. Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Yeah, the rule of thumb for that is you can't have enough backups.
Very true. Very true. Great.